Okay, so the Mishnah, we're in the second parak now of Masechet Shavuot, and the Mishnah was talking about the prohibition of going into the Beit HaMikdash B'tumah, which of course comes in this week's parsha, and previous weeks recently we've had it. But the question that the Mishnah addressed is, what's the Beit HaMikdash, right? How do you define that space? So, hello, Miriam. Just getting started. So we are up to, I don't know if you got up to the same place, but 2 dots at the second line of Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph. It's a logical place if you're learning Daf Yomi, it seems like. So the Mishnah was talking about, the prohibition is going into the Beit HaMikdash if you're Tameh, or if you can't eat something if you're Tameh, etc. But the question in the Mishnah was, how do you define the territory of the Beit HaMikdash, right? And so this is a very important and practical question, partly as we're going to see in today's Gemara, because over time they did construction, right? And they added to the Beit HaMikdash, they added to the Azara, they added to the area of Yerushalayim, and those are all halachic things. And the question is, do those additions, matter halachically? So of course, the Beit HaMikdash is where you can't go in B'tumah, but remember, there's a halacha that you can only eat certain karbanot in certain places, right? And maaser, for example, you can only eat in Yerushalayim. Now, let's say you like today, Yerushalayim extends for like 50 miles or something. You know what I mean? Like, is the airport Yerushalayim, right? So obviously not. But where does it go to? And so our Mishnah said that the only way you can add on to the Azara, to the Beit HaMikdash, is with this whole procedure we talked about in the Mishnah, where you have I'll read it, where you have a melech, a navi, urim v'tumim, Sanhedrin shel shivim ve'achad, and shtei todot, shir and beitin mahalchim. Shir, right? So space and beitin, beitin, 7 things basically. And the Mishnah said that you have to do, that's what you need. Says the Gemara today at the top of Daf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph, second line. The Mishnah said, Kol shlo nasot b'chol elo, if you didn't do these things, it's not considered to be official. Itmar. Now says the Gemara, what does it mean, all of these things? Rav Huna Amar, b'chol elu tznan. That you have to have all of these things. You have to have every single detail on that list. The king and the Navi and the Beit Din and the Urim v'Tumim, etc. You need to have everything, or else it's not official. And Rav Huna says, no. What it means is, where am I? Did I repeat this? Rav Nachman says, be'achat mikol elu tznan. It means any of the above. You don't need to have everything. You need to have some of it or one of it. And so as long as you have at least the king or at least the Navi or at least a Urim v'Tumim, it's considered to be an addition. Now, of course, the case where we're about to prove it from is the case of Ezra. So in Sefer Nehemiah, it talks about Ezra coming up and them having a procedure, very vague about when this was in Jewish history, what was existed. The Gemara goes through a lot of things that don't add up to the Psukim and the Psukim, whatever. It's complicated. But there's no doubt that this was referring to the second Beit HaMikdash. And Ezra came up to do some kind of Chanukah. And it talks about him getting there and talking and reading the Torah and bringing karbanot and singing. But of course, there was no king at that time, right? There was no melech because they didn't have melucha. And there was no Urim v'Tumim because the Urim v'Tumim was lost with the first Beit HaMikdash and never came back. So still, they went and made this and did this process. So the question is, why did he do the process if it wasn't all of the things? So according to Rav Nachman, it's fine because it was just one of them, right? You just needed some of them. But according to Rav Huna, what did it do? So let's read this inside. Rav Huna says, B'kol elu tznan, you can need all of these, but he holds that really Ezra was not doing anything. Because Ezra, or Rav Huna holds, that Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shata, V'Kedusha L'Atid Lavo, the original Kedusha of Shlomo HaMelech, or David HaMelech, or Shlomo probably, was Kedusha forever. And so when the Jews came back for the second Beit HaMikdash, and when we go back, God willing, for the next one, we don't need to be Mekadesh Azara. It's already Kodesh, right? So why did Ezra do the process? Not to make it Kodesh, because Ezra's process couldn't have made it Kodesh because he didn't have all the parts. But Ezra did it, Ezra Zecher Ba'amu Da'avad. He did it for a ceremony. He wanted everyone to remember, this is the Beit HaMikdash, we're making it new, it's a new procedure, but it was not actually official. It was an unofficial ceremony, essentially. It was a Zecher. And Rav Nachman says, no, ba'achat mikol elu tznan, you only need one of the above in the Mishnah, because he holds Kedusha Rishona Kedusha L'Shata v'lo Kedusha L'Atid Lavo, that the first Kedusha ended when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. When they came back for the second Beit HaMikdash, they needed to be Mekadesh the land again. Now, you can't do that unless you go through the process of our Mishnah, but you don't need all the steps in the Mishnah, you just need at least one of them. And Ezra, Kiddushay Kaddish, Ezra was in fact Mikadesh, the Beit HaMikdash, Afal Gavdalo Havi Urim V'Tumim, even though there was clearly no Urim V'Tumim in the second Beit HaMikdash. So that is the Machloket, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Of course, it's very relevant for the third Beit HaMikdash, right, which we referenced in Yecheskel today, but that is a question that's very relevant for us. Now, Eitvei Rava Rav Nachman. Asked Rava to Rav Nachman, how could you say that you need any of these? The Mishnah says the words Kol Shelo Nasit B'Chol Elo Tni. B'Chol Elo. The Mishnah says any of them. Tni, no, you have to change it. It means Ba'achat Mikol Elo. It means any one of these. So he would modify the Mishnah. Okay, Tashma. Now we've got a Tosefta, a Braita, which adds a very interesting detail, which will be relevant for this question. What does the Tosefta say in Sanhedrin? Abba Shaul Omer. Abba Shaul is talking about the geography. He was a tour guide, right, of the Beit HaMikdash. And he said, Shnei bitz'in hayu b'har mashcha. There were two bitz'in are agamim, Rashi says, swamps. That's not what Rashi says. Rashi says, marishka.
Marshes.
Yeah, which is marshes. Oh, thank you. Okay. So there were two marshes, which I guess means, now in this context, it means areas that were probably, full of water back in the day, and they were not developed land. That were
Corin Steinsaltz says ponds.
Okay, that sounds like the same idea as marshes,
Yeah.
but okay. They were on Har HaMashcha. Now, Har HaMashcha, of course, is what we call Har Zaitim today, which are Mashcha and Zaitim are the same thing, right? So in the Beit HaMikdash is on Har HaMoriah, we call it. I don't know what else they call it. And then if you go down that hill to what side is that? The north, the west, the east, right? The west or the east? West. To the west of what's where the Temple Mount is today, you get to Har Zitim, right, which of course is there. And there were two areas that they sort of wanted to include and ultimately built fences around or walls around to include into this area of Yerushalayim. One was, we'll see, on the bottom of the hill, and one was as you go up the hill. Okay, so there were Shnei Bitzayim, two swamps or marshes or ponds on Har HaMashcha, Tachtona v'Elyona. The bottom one and the top one. Remember, if you're going from one side to the other, the bottom one is closer than the top one, right? Because you go down first and you go up. So Tachtona, now the bottom area was included in Yerushalayim with all of these procedures. Nitzkadsha b'chol elu. It had all the procedures, the king and the Navi and the Urim V'Tumim and everything like that. And therefore it becomes a real part of Yerushalayim. And you can eat maaser there, and you can eat karbonot there if they're kachim kalim. But Elyona lo nitkadsha b'chol elu. The top part they built a wall around it, but they didn't do this whole process. And we're just going to ask in a second why they did it if they didn't do the whole process. Ella, so now what happened was, Ella be'olei gola, it was added by the people who came from the Galut, they didn't have a king, they didn't have an Urim V'Tumim, so they didn't officially add the top part. So now Tachtona, the bottom part of that they added, Shaita Kedushata Gemura, it was legit added to the Yerushalayim. Still, the Amei Haaretz, the Amei Haaretz were here, which is a terminology for, the commoners, maybe. Nichnasim l'sham, they would go and stay there. They had nice hotels and Airbnbs in that area. But ochlim sham kachim kalim, they would eat their kachim kalim, which you can eat anywhere in Yerushalayim, so they were really allowed to eat it there. Avalo maaser sheni, they wouldn't eat their maaser sheni there. Rashi explains very interestingly and a little cynically, I guess, that the Amei Haaretz were very careful about maaser, because there's a famous dictum, aser to aser, right? That you should take maaser b'shvil shetit asher, right? Read it as a shin instead of a sin. Take maaser so that you become rich. So that people had a lot of associations that if you take maaser and you're careful with maaser, you'll become wealthy. And so they were very makbid, even not halacha, right? Because the halacha, kachim kalim and maaser are the same thing. So if you're eating your karbonot, you should be also willing to eat your maaser, but they wouldn't eat their maaser in that area. So if you stayed in the hotels on the bottom of the hill, no one could eat breakfast, right? You couldn't have maaser for your meals. But chaverim, the educated people, the scholars, ochlim sham kachim kalim maaser sheni, they ate everything there because it was legitimately part of Yerushalayim. However, the Elyona, the top part, which again was enclosed by the walls, but was not kadesh, shalaita kedushata gemura, was not fully part of Yerushalayim. Amei Haaretz hayinichnasim l'sham. So the regular people would go there, and they also ate their kachim kalim because they figured, hey, it's part of Yerushalayim, it's the wall, even though it's not. Ochlim shem kachim kalim, avalo maaser sheni. But again, they're very strict on their maaser sheni. But the chaverim, the educated people, ein ochlim sham lo kachim kalim lo maaser sheni. They didn't eat either one because they knew that although it looks like it's part of Yerushalayim and has walls with Yerushalayim, it's not halachically part of Yerushalayim, and you can't eat your Maaser Sheni or your Kachim Kalim in that area. Now, continues the Braita. Mipnei Malo Kidsha. Why didn't they add on officially this top part? Because She'im Mosifin Al Yer V'Al Zarot, you can't add on, like our Mishnah said, El B'Melech V'Naviv Urim V'Tumim Sanhedrin Shal Ayin Echad Shivim V'Echad U'B'Shtei Todot U'B'Shir. Okay, so that's the Braita. Again, same words as our Mishnah. And finally, the Braita says, the Lama Kitshua, why did they make it Kodesh? What do you mean, why did they make it Kodesh? You just said they didn't do it. Lama Kitshua, Amrit Lo Kitshua. You said that the top portion was not added officially as Kedusha. So what do you mean, why did they do it? They didn't do it. Ella, what we mean is, why did they bring the wall there? Why did they incorporate it in Yerushalayim if it's not Kodesh? Ella Lama Hichnisua. Why did they bring it in as part of the city? And the reason is, it was an exposed area of Yerushalayim, meaning it was a high mountain right outside Yerushalayim. And if you leave that outside the city, people are going to go there and use it to attack and capture the city and send rockets or soldiers or, all the things that they used to do back then. And therefore, they felt like they had to conquer it to be part of the city, but they didn't conquer it to be halachically or kedusha-wise part of the city. So they incorporated it, but they didn't essentially utilize it in the way of the city. So that's the Braita. Where am I? Sorry, it was Turbash Yerushalayim Haita Venucha Huhi Lichavesh Misham. It was easy to conquer Yerushalayim from there. Now, the reason we're quoting this Braita is the Braita is very clear that the reason that they were not Mekadesh, the upper city, is because they didn't have all the pieces you need, right? They didn't have the king and the Urim B'Tumim and the Sanhedrin Shel Shivim Echad. But according to Rav Nachman, you don't need all the pieces, right? You only need one of them. So why couldn't they at least, have a Kohen Gadol, maybe, or, one part of it? Says where you're right. In fact, this Braita very clearly implies that you need everything. But Tanai, it's a Machloket Tanaim, and Rav Nachman has another Tana who he relies on. The Tanya. What is the Machloket? Now remember, we're connecting this to the question of Kedusha Rishona, Kidsha L'Shata, and Kidsha L'Tilavo, right? Because if you hold that Kedusha Rishona was Kidsha for that time and not for the future, then when Ezra came and did his thing, it shouldn't have worked because there was no Urim V'Tumim, right? So you must then hold what Rav Nachman holds, that you don't need everything, right? If you needed everything, how did they make the second Beit HaMikdash? But if you hold that Kedusha is Kedusha forever, you don't need to make the second Beit HaMikdash Kodesh. It already is Kodesh, right? So that's the Machloket Tanaim that's going to underlie the Machloket Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda. Says the Rav Huna, sorry. Says the Braita now, the first wide line. The Tanya, Amar Reb Eliezer. Said Reb Eliezer, this is a Mishnah in Idiot. Shamati, I heard, I was taught, Kishayubonim behechal, when they built, right, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed and they had to rebuild it, or in Herod's time when they had to, build everything together again. When they used to build in the Heichal, they would put up sheets. So, there was no walls because it was destroyed, but they were doing construction, but they would put up temporary walls, basically, to give some kind of privacy. Now, of course, we don't know exactly why they built these walls yet. So let's see in the Mishnah. They put up these kla'im, lehechal, and they would put up kla'im lazarot. They put up these tents, not tents, like tarps, basically, that were temporary walls, the hechal and for the azara. Ella shebehechal bonim mibechutz. In the hechal, they would put the wall sort of on the inside, and they would build from the outside, so you weren't inside the hechal when you were building. Of azarot bonim mibefnim. And azarot, they would build from the inside to the outside. So, we're assuming, and we're going to see in a second, that according to Reb Eliezer, the reason they put up these walls, these temporary walls, is because they wanted to bring karbanot while they were building. But you couldn't bring karbanot if you didn't have walls, which implies that the Kedusha is dependent on the building, right? It's not forever. So that's one opinion. And Amar Rabbi Yoshua, says Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati, I heard, and we think he's arguing, Shemakrivim af b'shein bayit, that you can bring a karban even if there's no Beit HaMikdash. The place is Kodesh. If the walls are destroyed, unfortunately, you still karban in the Beit HaMikdash. And ochlim kachem kachim af b'shein klaim. You can go inside and eat kachim in Nazara, even if there are no walls, and kachim kalam naser sheni af b'shein choma. Even if there's no wall of Yerushalayim, the space of Yerushalayim is there, and it's always Kodesh. Mipnei shekedusha rishona kitcha l'shata because the original Kedusha of David and Shlomo was Kedusha for that time and forever. So the implication is the Rebbe Yeshua holds that, but Rebbe Eliezer says that's not true, and you have to put these temporary walls in order to be able to work in the Beit and bring karbanot and eat in the Beit HaMikdash. Lav michlad Rebbe Eliezer savar lo kichalati lavo. The Rebbe Eliezer argues, and you see it's machloket tanaim. Amar le Ravina le Ravashi said Ravina to Ravashi, I disagree. That's not necessarily a proof from that Mishnah. Mimai. How do you know that? Maybe everybody thinks that Kedusha Rishona was Kedusha for then and forever. These halachot, these are not exclusive halachot. They're reporting what they heard. Rabbi Eliezer heard that this is how they built it. Rabbi Yeshua heard this is how they built it. They're not necessarily arguing about the Kedusha of the space of the Beit HaMikdash. Doesn't matter. Well, if that's the case, so what? I explain. Even if Rabbi Eliezer heard this is how they built it, what's the point, right? Why build temporary walls if you don't need them? If Kedusha is forever, just take your time, build the permanent wall, and during the time that you're building it, you'll have no wall. But that's not a problem. You don't need a wall. So why would you have a temporary wall? The chitema, so you're going to ask, Rabbi Eliezer lamali. So why do you need walls according to Rabbi Eliezer, right? There's no need if the Kedusha is without the walls. That might be l'tzniut ba'alma. It might just be because it's not, it's tzniut. You don't want to be in there and doing because they always put up fences around construction sites, right? It's a common thing. So you don't necessarily want people staring and looking in, and especially if you're doing karbanot inside that space. So that doesn't prove that's Kedusha l'shata and not l'tidlafo. Sorry. Ella says the Gemara around 12 lines or 15 lines in the bottom. Hani tonight. There's a different machloket tanaim, which clearly says the opinion that Kedusha Rishona Kitcha Shata and not Kitcha Latid the Tanya. As the Breita says, and it's Breita in Masechet Megillah, but it really belongs in Erechin, right? There are separate halachot, there's special halachot. The Mishnah says in Erechin, what are called Batei Arei Choma, right? Cities in houses in a city that's walled. And the Mishnah gives a list of these were the walled cities, right? And says Rabbi Yishmael in a Breita, Amar Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, Lama Manu Chachamim et Elu. Why did the Chachamim mention, right? It comes after the list in the Mishnah of certain walled cities. And Rabbi Yishmael says in the name of his father Rabbi Yossi, why did we list these? Meaning, presumably there were dozens and dozens of walled cities. The Mishnah only lists 9 of them. Why did we only list these 9? Because when they came up from Galut, which is always a reference to the second Beit HaMikdash, right? When they were exiled and they came back from Bavel, they found these 9 cities that are listed in the Mishnah, and they gave them Kedusha, meaning they said these are treated like walled cities. Remember, walled cities have halachot where you can't have tzarat in a walled city, you can't be goleh, right? There's all kinds of different details that matter. Aval, Rishonot, but all the previous cities that were walled cities, their status of being a walled city is canceled once the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The Jews were kicked out of the land of Israel. Basically, it was reset, and every status of Yoshua was lost when they came back with Ezra. So Alma Kasaf, what you see from this Mishnah, it's Breita, is that Rabbi Shmuel holds Kedusha Rishona Kitcha Shata V'lo Kitcha Lati Lavo. That Kedusha applies for the time, we're saying your time of Yoshua in this case, and then it stops. And unless you rededicate it, it doesn't become Kodesh again. So that is what Rav Nachman was relying on when he said that opinion earlier. Doesn't matter about Bermini, but I got a contradiction in the next words in the Breita. These are actually the previous words in the Breita. Because the previous words in the Breita were, or they're really not the same Breita, but this previous context of the Breita. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi said, what do you mean? This list of 9 walled cities, are these the only walled cities? Hello, Kvarnemer, it says way back in the beginning of Devarim, Shishim Ir, there were 60 cities, right? The Kol Chevel Argov, the whole area of the Argov, Mamlechet Og Babashan, the area of Og, Kol Elo, all of this area were Arim B'tzurot Choma Gvoa, were fortified cities with tall walls. So you see that there were many walled cities. So why do we only mention 9? Ella says Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, Lama Manu Chachamim et Ela. Why did we mention these 9 cities? To tell you, When the Bnei Gola came up, they found these cities and they were Mekadesh them. Again, so far, this is the exact thing he said before. But it continues the Braita, or the Gemara says, what do you mean? Kidshum Hashta? What do you mean he made them Kodesh? Ha'amrinan lekaman, we're going to say in a little bit, Lo tzrichan lekadusha. You don't need to be Mekadesh them. Ella, what it means is matzu elu umanum. He found, we'll see, the Braita continues in a second. He found these, not he, the Olei Golev, led by Ezra, let's say, found these 9 walled cities and they enumerated them, meaning they put out, signposts, this is a city, this is the designation, this is where it is. Presumably they were empty or not populated, but they named them. And now continues the Braita, and this is what we were referencing before. The low Elo Bovad, it's not just these cities, right? Meaning it's not, they found these 9 cities, they designated them, but these are not the only walled cities that have halacha of a walled city. Elakol shetaleh biyadcha mesoret me'avotecha shemukefet choma mimot Yoshua ben Nun. If you find any city and you have a credible, heritage, Masorah, that it was walled from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, then all the halachot of a walled city apply to it, right? So then, where am I? 5 lines from the bottom. If no kol mitzvot ela no hegetpa. All of the rules of walled cities will apply to that city. Why? Continues the Braita. Nipnei shekedusha rishana kitcha l'shata v'kitcha latin lavo. Because the kedusha that Yoshua and his aliyah made, right, was for the time of Yoshua and forever. So these were the 9 cities that they found. But if you find another city and you discover it and you dig it up, or it's not underground, then that would have the same halacha. So here you have Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi saying 2 contradictory things. In one Braita, he says it's these 9 cities because they didn't count anything else. And the fact is they only found these 9 cities, and therefore they only rededicated these 9 cities and nothing else counts. And the other Braita says he mentioned these 9 cities, he found them, they put signposts for them, but any city you find will retain its kedusha. So you see clearly there's 2 Tanaim. Now they happen to have the same name, which is a problem, but there's 2 Tanaic opinions. One is kedusha rishana is kitcha l'shata and latid lavo, and one is not latid lavo. Ask the Gemara, well, but still it's a problem because it's the same name, right? Kashya, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. How you can have 2 Tanaic opinions, but you can't have one Tana hold 2 Tanaic opinions. So how do you explain the contradiction in the 2 Braitot? Now, one answer is that sometimes there's a dispute about what someone says, right? It happens all the time. Trey Tanaya Levi Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. There were 2 Tanaim who had different traditions, the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So each one went to his school and they came home with a different tradition. It happens, right? And we accept that they were both valid traditions in some way. That's one opinion, or they're not valid, but you can argue either one. Or Ibai Dema, or another explanation is, of course, that we sometimes get our names mixed up. Ibai Mchada Minaya Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi, I guess, had many sons, and one was Rabbi Shmuel, but another was Rabbi Lazar. And maybe the 2 sons of Rabbi Yossi disagreed, and they were quoted differently, but they got confused, and they had the same name, but in fact, they are different sons of Rabbi Yossi. The Tanya, and that's actually supported by the following Braita, Rabbi Lazar of Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Lazar, now the other son of Rabbi Yossi, said, Asher lo choma. It talks about a walled city, and it says the word lo, which we can, well, this is talking about a city that doesn't have a wall, right? And it says lo, with an aleph, right? It does have a wall. It says lo choma. It has a wall, right? But with a vav is how you read it. It has a wall, but it's written with an aleph, which is a no, right? Lo choma. It does not have a wall. The way we understand this is afal pi she'ein lo achshav hayala v'hayala kotem lechein. What it means is that even a city that does not have a wall right now, but once had a wall, is considered to be a walled city, right? So if it was a walled city at one point and the wall fell down or whatever was destroyed, the fact is it's still a walled city because according to this opinion, which is Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi, kedusha rishana kitcha l'shata ula atid lavo. So once it's a walled city even if the wall no longer exists. And so that is where we end with that very important machloket. I'll just point out, and Tosfos here discusses this to some extent, but this is a quite complex sugya that, of course, we've conflated a lot of things in our Gemara today so far, right? Which is that the Kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash is one thing, right? And has very big implications from going in B'tumah and bringing a carbon and all of those things. The Kedusha of Yerushalayim is another thing, right? And it has very big implications for eating Maaser Sheni and eating Kachim Kalim, things like that. The Kedusha of walled cities is a whole nother level, right? They have nothing to do with Yerushalayim. So we in this Gemara sort of put all these things together, and you can imagine, Tosfos points out that that's not always the case, that you can have Kedusha of one that persists, but not the other, right? So it could be that the land doesn't persist, but the Beit HaMikdash does, or vice versa. So it's obviously a very complex sugya, and of course, there's huge implications for people who want to go up on Har HaBayit nowadays, and whether there's Kedusha there, and many other geopolitical discussions.
Well, that was something I was thinking of, that by the opinion that you need all of these things, at least for part of the Temple Mount, you don't even know you need to go to the mikveh,
Right.
because it was greatly expanded during the time of Herod.
Who didn't have all these things, correct?
And they definitely didn't have all, and you can even question whether Herod was a real king or not, but they certainly didn't have an Urim Tumim.
Right. So,
And they
so
certainly didn't have
I agree
another.
with you. They didn't have an Urim Tumim. The question, I think you raised another great point. Is Herod a king? Did they have a Kohen Gadol? You would count as a Kohen. Like, these are all
Yeah.
great questions. And I think they're discussed practically, not in the world that I live in too much, because we don't talk about this, but about going to the Har HaBayit. But there are people who are very consumed with the halacha question about can you go on the Har HaBayit? Where can you go on the Har HaBayit? Which part? All those things. And these are very relevant details when those discussions happen.
Can you go in the mikveh? So Rabbi Linzer made a point. If you go to the mikveh in the morning, before you go in the Har HaBayit in the afternoon, you're Tevil Yom.
Right.
So if in fact you needed to have all these things, you didn't even really have to go to the mikveh in the morning. That's just a chumrah.
Anyways, so okay, let's continue. The next thing in the
All
Mishnah was, the Mishnah said, Nitzma ba'azara. Remember, we had really a third case in the Mishnah. One case in the Mishnah is that you're tamei and you eat kachim. A second case is you're tamei and you go into the Beit HaMikdash. A third case is where you're not tamei, you're tahar. You walk into the Beit HaMikdash and then you become tamei, right? All the misfortune of becoming tamei in the Beit HaMikdash, right?
So that's easy to do. If you're shechting your korban and you screw up the shkita, you have touched an avela.
Okay, well, there's different levels of tuma, but we
I mean, that's a minor level of tuma, but it's still you're still tamei.
Okay, so let's say you're nitzma ba'azara and you forgot. Now, if you did it on purpose and you're bemazed, actually, we're going to get to this tomorrow probably. That presumably you get makot. We'll talk about it tomorrow actually, because you went into the Beit HaMikdash, you stayed there b'tumah. But let's say you didn't know about it, you forgot. So do you bring a korban olev yoreh, right? So the Mishnah said, Nalma mimeno tumah. So ask the Gemara first of all, how do you even know that's included? But the Torah says, don't go into Beit HaMikdash when you're tamei. How do you know that if you went in when you were tahar and became tamei, that you got to leave right away? So tumah be'azara minalan. How do you know that? Amar Belazar, because there's two psukim. Katuv echad omer. One pasuk says at Mishkan Hashem timei, that person should get killed because they were Mishkan Hashem. They made tamei. The Katuv echad omer. One pasuk says ki et Mikdash Hashem timei, right? That they made the mish. So you notice the different word, Mishkan and Mikdash, right? Says the Gemara. I'm going to read the parentheses because probably it's correct. Imeno inyan l'tumah shebechutz. If it doesn't refer to getting tamei outside and going in, because he already said that, so we'll apply it to becoming tamei inside, and the halacha is you have to leave as quickly as you can, and if you don't leave quickly, you are over an isser of being tamei in the Beit HaMikdash. Says Gemara, is that true? Is Krai Miyatri? Huh? Is it really an extra pasuk? We need it for the following brayta. The Tanya Rebbe Elazar Omer. Rebbe Elazar asked this question explicitly. Im nemar mishkan, lama nemar mikdash. The Torah says, don't go into the Mishkan b'tumah. Why did it say separately the Mikdash? Im nemer Mikdash, lama nemer Mishkan. If it said the Mikdash, like, why do we need both, right? Ella, said Rebbe Lazar, ilu nemer Mishkan, nemer Mikdash, fascinating Gemara. If you just said that you can't go into the Mishkan b'tumah, you know what I would have thought? I would have thought the prohibition of going in is only in going into the Mishkan. You know what? Excuse me. Im nemer Mishkan, v'lo nemer Mikdash, there's something more kaddish about the Mishkan than the Beit HaMikdash because Moshe Rabbeinu poured shemen on over all the parts and the things in the Mishkan, and he didn't do that in the Beit HaMikdash. There's no indication of that. So maybe the Mishkan is more holy in this way than the Beit HaMikdash. Al Mikdash lo yehi chayav. So I might have thought that. Nemar Mikdash lo nemar Mishkan. If it said the Mikdash, but didn't say the Mishkan, I would say, well, of course, the Beit HaMikdash is a much more permanent place of Kedusha because it's connected to that place. A Mikdash yeh chayav, sharei Kedushato Kedushat Olam. The place, and again, this has a lot to do with the previous sugya, but let's just read it this way: the kedusha of the Beit Hamikdash is forever. A mishkan lo yeh chayav because it's not permanent, right? The mishkan moves everywhere. You walking into the mishkan is only where the mishkan is. If the mishkan moves and you walk in there b'tumah, you're not over anything, right? The kach nemer, therefore, says Rebbe Lazar in the Braita, it says mishkan, the kach nemer mikdash, and it says mishkan and mikdash. So how could you say that it's extra to tell you that there's a prohibition of being tamei and going inside? And if you're tamei inside, staying inside, you needed to tell me that you can't go into both the Mishkan and the Mikdash. Says Gemara that you're misunderstanding Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar is not saying an extra pasuk. Rebbe Lazar haki kashali. Rebbe Lazar was bothered by the following thing. Michti, look, Mishkan ikri Mikdash, Mikdash ikri Mishkan. We know that these words are used interchangeably, essentially, right? We very frequently refer to the Mishkan. We're going to see more comment examples in a second, but we refer to the Mishkan as the Mikdash, and the Mikdash as the Mishkan. So why don't you just use the same word twice? Nichtav o idi v'idi Mikdash or idi v'idi Mishkan. Say Mikdash twice or Mishkan twice, and I'll know it refers to both the Mishkan and the Mikdash, right? Mishkan u Mikdash. I'm sorry, I would know that it refers to both Tuma outside and Tuma inside. Mishkan u'mikdash lamli. Why did you change the word from Mishkan to Mikdash? Shmamina tarti. So therefore, I see two things, which is that not only is it both Tuma inside and Tuma outside, but also it's both the Mishkan and the Mikdash. I says, where do you see that? Bishma Mikdash ikre Mishkan. I see that the Beit HaMikdash is referred to as the Mishkan. Dichtiv, as it says, Minatati Mishkani betochechem. I will put my Mishkan among you. And in context, Rashi explains, at least here, there's other explanations, that's referring to after the Jews went into Eretz Yisrael, and right, the Pesukim are talking about, you're going to go up into Eretz Yisrael, and I will put my Mishkan among you. Now, that there's no Mishkan then, it means the Beit HaMikdash. And it also says, where am I? But how about the other way? Sorry, El Mishkan Dikri Mikdash Minalan. Where do you ever see that the Mishkan of the desert or Shiloh, excuse me, is referred to as a Mikdash? Well, maybe it's because the pasuk says V'nasua Katim Nosei HaMikdash, that the Katim carry the Mikdash. Now, of course, they didn't carry the Beit HaMikdash, right? They carried the Mishkan. They weren't. That was not referring to the Mishkan. That was referring to the Aron. Remember, Kahat didn't carry the Mishkan; they carried the Aron, the Kalim. Ahuba Aron Ktiv. So Mikdash there is not referring to the Mishkan. Elami Hacha. Pasuk says Asur li Mikdash. Right, the first initial pasuk when Hashem says to them, the Moshe says to them from Hashem, make a Mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham. Now, of course, they made a Mishkan, right? And it says Ktiv kol asher ani maretcha et tavnit hamishkan. In the next pasuk, because the next pasuk, it says everything I showed you about the Mishkan. So clearly, when Hashem is saying make a Mikdash and says this is the Mishkan, it's the exact same thing. And so we know that the Mishkan and the Mikdash are generally used interchangeably. Okay, the next thing in the Mishnah was, let's say a person, remember, if a person's tamei and they walk into the Beit HaMikdash, they're chayiv right away. But if they become tamei in the Beit HaMikdash, then they have to leave, right, as quickly as they can. And we're going to discuss tomorrow or soon, I think, what if they leave in the long route or the slow route, etc. But the Mishnah said that you have to bow down, right? I mean, it has to be the amount of time that you bow down. So the Mishnah said the following, Hishtachava, Sheshahad Kedei Hishtachava. Even if you don't actually bow down in the Beit HaMikdash, but you stayed for long enough to bow down. Right, so let's say a minute. I mean, we'll see. It's less than a minute, of course, but 10 seconds. Amar Rava. Now says Rava. What this is actually saying to you, right, is lo shanu el shishtachaveh klapei pnim. It's saying if you bow down towards the Beit HaMikdash, meaning facing to the Kodesh HaKadashim, right? Aval shtachava klapei chutz. But if you bow down the other way, meaning you bow down, I don't know why you would do that, but you bow down not directing towards the Aron in the Beit HaMikdash, then that's not considered to be doing an avodah, and shaha'in lo shahalo. Then it's contingent on you spending enough time there for it to work and not spending enough time. Meaning you could bow down, we'll see, we're going to discuss this in a second, very quickly. That's not a long enough time. That's a super fast, nod your head kind of thing. If you do that you're only chayiv if you're facing towards the Beit HaMikdash because you're basically worshiping B'tumah. But if you're facing away from it, that's not enough unless you spend enough time to do a proper full bowing down. We'll see what that means in a second. Now, now some said that this statement of Rava was referring to the end of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said, "Oh, sheshahag b'chtei ishtachava." It said that you can bow down or stay for long enough in order to do a proper bowing down. Now that Michlal says, the Gemara says, "Tishtachava gufa b'ishia," implies that even if you bow down, you're only high for bowing down if you do a slow bowing down. You do long enough for a full procedure. And that's what Rava said. Amar Rava, well, that's only true that bowing down requires also waiting. If you bow down facing outwards, because you didn't really face the Kodesh Kodashim. If you bow down inside, towards the inside, then even if you didn't stay for long enough to do a full ishtachava, you'd still be chayiv. And this is what the Mishnah means to say, and it's the same either way. Ishtachava klape pnim. You either bow down facing inwards towards the Kodesh, or you waited long enough for a full bowing down, then you're chayav. Now, ask me, what does that mean, right? What's bowing down that's long enough and bowing that's not long enough, right? What's the difference? What do you mean? One is bowing down but not waiting long enough, and one is bowing down and waiting long enough. Where we said if you bow down and don't wait long enough, you're only chayiv if you face inward. Now, if you're facing outward, what does that mean? Says Gemara, well, what it means is delet b'shihiyah zu kriya ba'alma. That's if you just kriya means you kneel down, right? You just kneel down, you stood up, and you walked out. That would only be chayav if you're facing inwards, right? And you're tamei. But if you did that facing the other way, that's not a full bowing down. That's just a perfunctory maybe, or a partial bowing down. The itbashihiyah, what is the itbashihiyah? That means pishut yadayim v'raglayim, when you spread out your arms and your legs, you get down on the ground, you spread out your whole body. It takes a lot more time. I guess you spend some time on the ground. It's a little bit longer. So one might be 5 seconds and one is 10 seconds or whatever, something like that. So it's a little bit longer. Ask them, well, how much longer? Kama shir shihiyah. What exactly does that mean? You're bowing down, spreading out your body. How long does that take? So very interesting. Says the Gemara, we are, just to give context, 8 lines, 10 lines, 9 lines from the bottom, second word on the line. Pligi bar Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani v'chadi ime. Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani and someone with him argued about this. Now, who was that person? Right, which is an interesting way to describe it. Manu, that person, was Rav Shimon ben Pazi. So we remember Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani a little bit better, but the other person was Rav Shimon ben Pazi. Now, some say it was the opposite. Amrila, some say it was Rav Shimon ben Pazi and Chadi Imei and Manu Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani, right? And some say, Amrila, some say Rav Shimon bar Nachmani, not Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani, but I guess his brother, the Rav Shimon bar Nachmani. Either way, whoever it was, that what was the Chad Amar once said that the length of Shia was Kimimra Dahai Psuka. He's like saying the following pasuk, the Bach, then the Gra, is this the Bach or the Gra? The Bach, sorry, takes out the next 4 words. You'll see why in a second. We're going to put them back in a little bit later. That the pasuk is the following pasuk in Divrei Yamim, which now says, V'chol b'nei Yisrael ro'im, all of b'nei Yisrael saw beredet ha'esh, when the fire came down. This is referring to the Chanukah, the Mishkan, Beit HaMikdash. The fire came down, Ukvod Hashem al habayit, and the Kvod of Hashem was on the house. They put down their faces apayim. They put down their faces on the ground. And they bowed. And they gave thanks to God that God was great. So that whole saying that, right? That's the amount of time, or doing that, I guess, is the amount of time of Shia is to say that whole pasuk, which is whatever number of seconds that takes. The other opinion, which the Bach sort of took out before, but he adds in now, is that it's v'chad amar my v'yichru'u l'seifa. It's not the whole pasuk, but it's from the word yichru'u, right, which is like halfway through that pasuk to the end of the pasuk, which says they bowed down to the ground, they prostrated themselves, and they thanked Hashem, ki tov, ki li olam chasto. So that is like a full, bowing down, and that you'd be chayiv no matter what direction you're facing in, and even if you didn't bow down, you just waited that long. But if you just do a quick kneeling, you're only chayav if you're facing towards the inside of the Beit HaMikdash. Finally, for today, I think we'll say 5 lines to the bottom. Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita, what's the difference in all these different kinds of bowing down? These are the terminology. Kida, when we use the word kida, which we use, sometimes about bowing down, that is alapayim. That's going down and putting your face to the ground. The Chein Omer, it says, Tikot Batsheva, it says the word kida, right, by Batsheva, and it says apayim arza, face was to the ground. Again, not so clear. Is your face touching the ground? Your face is in front of the, like when you lean down, you look at the ground, right? So you're facing the ground basically, but you're down close to the ground. That's what kida means. Kriya, the word kriya, which usually means prostrating, I think, or something like that. That's al birkaim. That's going down, bending, I guess, on your knees, right? Right? The famous psukim that they had only so many people who wouldn't prostrate on their knees to the Baal, right? So that's referring to, I guess, a lesser level of just going on your knees. Hishtachava, when we talk about hishtachava, that is like the full thing. Do pishut yadayim v'raglayim, that's going down, facing the ground, spreading out your arms and legs, putting yourself as if you are completely subjugated and on the ground. The Chenu Omer, and there it says by Yaakov says this, Havon navo ani v'imcha v'achecha l'shtachavot l'cha arza. Right, we're going to come to you and be flat on the ground. So hishtachava means you're basically giving over yourself to the ground, not just putting your face there, not just putting your knees there, but that is what it means when we talk about hishtachava. And
That's what priests do actually when they become ordinated.
Priests, not in Judaism, you're saying?
Yes, definitely not in Judaism, in churches.
Okay, we will stop here at these last 2 dots and continue tomorrow. Can we do 7:45 a.m., Miriam, or not?
I'm gonna be on a flight to Chicago, so no.
Oh, and
What about you, Charlie? You're up in the morning?
I can do 7:45, or I could do in the evening.
Evening.
I don't think I'll be able to do in the evening either, so don't count me in.
Okay, so let's do the morning so we don't
Okay.
lose our Zriza Makdimim. I'll put it on the chat. And Miriam, I hope you have a nice flight. How long are you going for? Nice.
Just for Sunday, Monday.
Okay. Have a safe
Have a
trip.
great trip.
Thank you.
Shavuot tov.
Shavuot tov. Are you
tov.
here next week?
Me?
Yes, you.
I'm going to be around. I'm going to be in Connecticut, but I'll be
Okay.
around. That's close
You
enough.
said you were gonna be away 6 weeks in a row or whatever.
No, so I'll be away, and then the next week I'm in Chicago, but I think the timing works out that I could do Motzaei Shabbat. I looked
Okay.
Yeah, it's
right.
only 1 hour different. We're in Connecticut.
We go to Cecily's family's house in the northwest corner, Lakeville, Connecticut.
Okay, sure, yeah.
We'll be there for Memorial Day weekend, but hopefully they'll have internet. We'll do Daf Yomi.
Great. All right.
All right.
Shavuot tov.
Shavuot tov.
See you tomorrow.